Force is strong in my family. Force is strong in my family. My father has it. My father has it. I have it. I have it. My sister has it. My sister has it. You have that power too. You have that power too. In time, you'll learn to use it as I have.
We would be honored if you would join us.
Chewie, we're home.
My Nerd World.
And welcome to My Nerd World. It is episode number 34 of the Star Wars podcast. I am your host, John Justice, and I am very pleased to welcome the second guest that I've ever had to the Star Wars My Nerd World podcast. Although, oddly enough, his first name is the same as the first guest on the podcast. This is Andrew Langer. He is the president of an organization called the Institute for Liberty. He is the host of his own podcast, the Langer Cast, weekly guest on my show, and we'll get into that just briefly. But hello, Andrew, and welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Happy to be here, John. You know, it's funny. We were going to go with a different name. Unfortunately, rebelalliance.org was already taken.
Well, this is going to be a lot of fun because Andrew is a huge Star Wars fan, albeit not a fan of the prequels, but we won't get into that. Well, actually, we may get into that just briefly.
You know, actually, John, we may have to get into it because this theory that we're going to be talking about, at least the theory, may actually redeem the prequels greatly.
I'm curious to find out if your line of thinking is heading down the same line of thinking that I'm on with it, but we'll get to that in a moment.
Sure.
What's going to be really fun about this, though, is that Andrew's a weekly guest on my radio show, and inevitably, because we've been able to, with the popularity of Star Wars right now, we've been able to talk about Star Wars, but we're always sort of confined to the time frame that we have, and also making sure that we do sort of maintain this level of keeping in the news talk box. And so now we can be unleashed in our Star Wars fandom. So I'm excited about this.
I like this. Ginning into the video game as well.
First off, man, the analysts are predicting right now Star Wars: The Force Awakens sits as the number 2 all-time box office earner. And they say that by Monday, it'll become number 1, toppling Avatar. And that to me, while not surprising, is really impressive. And I want to talk a little bit about that. But what are your initial thoughts on the fact that this movie is going to become the all-time box office winner, probably by a large margin, given the fact that it's only been on a couple of weeks, and it's going to hit this spot in a much shorter time frame than anybody could have predicted?
And listen, I think it's deserving of this, and I don't know if we're going to talk about Lucas's comments that he's now since walked back, but I'm wondering if this all plays into that somewhat. You know, George Lucas apparently not terribly happy, I guess, with the way that people have said that this essentially is the way that the prequel should have been done, drawing unfavorable or making the prequels look unfavorable by comparison. But listen, there weren't, despite the folks who I think, the old saying, haters gonna hate, there are always the usual suspects who are going to poo-poo a Star Wars movie. The movie didn't hit any down notes. It was as perfect a Star Wars film as you can get. Frankly, as I've been saying now, let me tell you, so happy that I could talk about, actually geek out about Star Wars in this kind of a form. To me, as far as I'm concerned, this is the second best movie in the series. I mean, nothing is going to supplant Empire Strikes Back as far as I'm concerned. But this is now my second favorite of the 7 movies that are out. And so, Yeah, I think it's well deserved.
It's become my favorite, and that is going off of the obvious, and that is you can't get to Episode 7 without certainly 4 and 5. Arguably, 6. You can't get there without the other movies. But if I'm going to rank them in terms of enjoyment and meaning, this has now reached the number 1 spot. Empire holds strong at number 2, but this movie to me strikes so many different interesting tones and conversations and ideas. Empire it's there, and it's got a great storyline, fantastic dialogue, amazing reveals. It's got everything there. To me, this movie takes it to a different level. They're very, very close. They're very close. But I think one thing I wanted to mention about its success, though, is I got this email, and I get these emails for requests for interviews on the show. And on my weekly radio show. And it was one of these ones of, Star Wars passes, the $1 billion mark, and, get this expert on. And there was a video attached to it. So I clicked on the video, and it was this guy sort of going over the top about how clean doing that thing with my fingers the movie is. And using this as an example of its success. And it was a little bit too... The video and the audio of the guy recording it was a little too on the nose. It was a little too righteous, in my opinion. I mean, even though I'm a Christian, but it did make some good points in that this movie doesn't have any gratuitous elements. And by example, we popped in Jurassic World the other night. And this was one of the top, I think it's number 2 or 3 now, all time, movies in terms of box office gross. And watching that, you can't say the same thing about Jurassic World. There's language in it. There's adult themes in it. And I'm not a prude by any stretch of the imagination, but this movie really, stripped all that away, and it was still great, and it's reaching across demographics. And I don't think it's the only reason, but I think it is a big reason why this movie is experiencing so much repeat viewing across multiple generations.
Well, and it appeals in ways that, frankly, the prequels didn't appeal to a lot of people, multiple audiences, right? Because Episode 1 was clearly... for all of its adult political themes, sort of the plotting, PLODDING, political themes of Episode 1, it was essentially a kid's movie. I mean, it's funny. I hadn't been thinking about that until this morning, where I watched the YouTube video where they took, Darth Vader from A New Hope, and they essentially substituted all of James Earl Jones' dialogue with Jake Lloyd's dialogue. And so you got, Jake Lloyd's voice coming out of Darth Vader's body, and you sort of sat there and like, yeah, I mean, it was clearly the language and tone was clearly meant for kids, and I get why George Lucas was doing that, but this was a movie that appealed on all levels, and maybe there's something to be said for the fact that there wasn't anything gratuitous. I mean, maybe the closest was Maz calling Chewbacca her boyfriend. Right.
Which is one of my favorite lines of the movie. The delivery on that is just spectacular.
And I cannot wait until we learn more about that backstory. You want to talk about compelling characters. That character is incredibly compelling. And I was nervous about stuff like that. In the previews, when you have Han Solo and Rey and Finn walking in, and there's this bad robot out in front of Maz's place, that it had the potential to be kitschy, right? But it wasn't. And so, the point is, you have stuff that appeals very much to kids. BB-8 certainly, but not in a pandering, awful, offensive way, as let's say Sebulba or Jar Jar Binks might have been. But you have, just really, and then you have stuff for adults, and and of course for the older Star Wars fan, relishing everything.
Really quick, and not that I want to spend too much time here, but you mentioned Sebulba there for a moment, and I'm wondering if you've picked up on this. I heard this on another podcast just briefly, and then in my mind, I kind of expanded on it, but it was actually a good point. Unkar Plutt, the junk dealer on Jakku, is essentially a rehash to a certain extent of Sebulba from the prequel trilogy. When you think about his role in kind of watching over, but not watching over, not being in charge of Anakin Skywalker on Tatooine, I mean, he's essentially doing the same thing, albeit Anakin was a slave in The Phantom Menace. He's doing the same thing. It's an interesting... There are a lot of very interesting parallels and nods that I think even a lot of individuals who don't like the prequels haven't picked up on. Now, they did it better, obviously. The Force Awakens did it much better than those movies did, than the prequels did. And I happen to like the prequels, but obviously I certainly like this movie much, much more. But they did, even the mention that Kylo had of, perhaps you'd be better off the First Order with the Clone Army. Very winky, winky, nudge, nudge. But they did a good job of not just bridging the gap with the original trilogy, but also not completely discounting those prequels that many of us still enjoy.
Well, this is why first of all, I think George Lucas's words were so ill-timed because I do think that given a couple of these theories that are out there, Abrams, and I love the fact that J.J. Abrams is now enunciating the fact that he is disappointed that he's not resentful, disappointed that he's not going to be directing the next movie. I think that's a good sign. But the fact is that J.J. Abrams is setting up these stories, and I guess Lawrence Kasdan. All credit goes to Kasdan. I don't remember who the other writers were for this, but credit goes to them that they really have made those hat tips. The only other thing I would have liked to have seen was some reference to Soylent Green when Rey is being handed her rations. That would have been fun.
People.
It is. That was just on TCM over the weekend, so we watched the end of that yesterday morning.
Well, it's interesting because I heard that, and I don't know which scenes they were, but I hear that Rian Johnson, who is directing and has now written Episode 8, actually wrote or was hands-on on a few key scenes of The Force Awakens. And I also heard that he wanted a couple other things in the movie change, but J.J. Abrams didn't do it. And this is all speculation, but I heard that there were a few things that Rian Johnson wanted changed in The Force Awakens so that he could, tie it into what he was doing. And J.J. Abrams said, no, we're going to, stick to what we're doing here. You bridge the gap on your end. But I did hear that Rian Johnson did come in and was heavily involved in a couple of key scenes. I wonder. My speculation is maybe the force back scene, which plays out quite a bit differently in the book, not quite as detailed as it did in the movie. And I'm wondering if perhaps there are a couple of just small items that or tweaking that was done during that scene when she touches the lightsaber that maybe Rian Johnson had his hand in, because he's gonna do something very different with Episode 8, much in the same way that we had something very different with The Empire Strikes Back. I mean, and that just based off of the movies he's done, if you've seen Looper or Brothers Grimm. But I'm curious to see what he brings to the table as not sort of a mainstream director.
It's funny because I get the sense that the Harry Potter movies got better as time went on. And part of that was because they did hand it off to different directors as the series progressed. And so as nervous as I might otherwise get by handing, these sequels, as important as they are, over to new directors, when you think about some of these other efforts that have had different visions attached to them, it's really worked out in the end. So, yeah, I guess my fundamental question to you is, because I've been considering it, I have to read the book, right? I have to now read the novelization.
I don't think you do. Okay. I've gone through and I've read almost all the spoilers not spoilers. I've read almost all of the key moments from the novelization that expand upon the movie. Basically, the canon breaks down like this. This is what Disney has said about the canon. Whatever is in the novel is canon, unless it contradicts something specifically from the movie. So if there is something in the movie take place